Hello everyone, welcome to today's lesson. Today's lesson is on life cycle assessments and recycling. Our challenge today is to be able to interpret life cycle assessments of different products and describe different ways of reducing the use of resources. Our aspire is to be able to compare life cycle assessments of different products to evaluate their impact on the environment and our sustainability. So before we get started, I want you to just think about what main resources do we use that come from our Earth. So let's have a look at each of these resources individually. So the first resource you may have mentioned is glass. Now, glass bottles can be reused. They can also be crushed, melted and used to make new glass products. So in terms of glass, it is recyclable. Now you may have also thought about plastics. Now plastics are made from crude oil, which is a finite resource and will run out. Plastics can be melted and used to make new products, but that's not all types of plastic. So we have to be mindful that some types of plastic are not recyclable. They are basically made from crude oil, so could also be burned to release energy, but that would obviously it would produce some carbon dioxide and that would contribute to global warming. You may have also thought of metals. Now metals come from a finite resource and mining is harmful to the environment. But metals can be melted and used to make new products. By separating out scrap metals, it can be expensive, especially if a new product requires a pure metal. But for metals such as copper, which we are running out of, that is definitely something we need to be considering. Like we've just said, it is useful if the metals don't need to be separated too much. So waste iron and steel can both be put into a blast furnace to reduce the amount of iron ore needed in the production of iron as a resource. Now I'm going to play a video that I think really makes you think about our impact on the environment.
Imagine aliens land on the planet 1,000,000 years from now and look into the geologic record. What will these curious searchers find of us? They will find what geologists, scientists, and other experts are increasingly calling the Anthropocene, or new age of mankind. The impacts that we humans make have become so pervasive, profound, and permanent that some geologists argue we merit our own epoch. That would be a new unit in the geologic timescale that stretches back more than 4.5 billion years, or ever since the Earth took shape. Modern humans may be on a par with the glaciers behind various ice ages, or the asteroid that doomed most of the dinosaurs. What is an epoch? Most simply, it's a unit of geologic time. There's the Pleistocene, an icy epoch that saw the evolution of modern humans. Or there's the Eocene, more than 34 million years ago, a hothouse time during which the continents drifted into their present configuration. Changes in climate or fossils found in the rock record help distinguish these epochs and help geologists tell deep time. So what will be the record of modern people's impact on the planet? It doesn't rely on the things that may seem most obvious to us today, like sprawling cities. Even New York or Shanghai may prove hard to find. buried in the rocks a million years from now. But humans have put new things into the world that never existed on Earth before, like plutonium and plastics. In fact, the geologists known as stratigraphers, who determine the geologic timescale, have proposed a start date for the Anthropocene, around 1950. That's when people started blowing up nuclear bombs all around the world and scattering novel elements to the winds. Those elements will last in the rock record, even in our bones and teeth, for millions of years. And in just 50 years, we've made enough plastic, at least 8 billion metric tons, to cover the whole world in a thin film. People's farming, fishing, and forestry will also show up as a before and after in any such strata, because it's those kinds of activities that are causing unique species of plants and animals to die out. This die-off started perhaps more than 40,000 years ago, as humanity spread out of Africa and reached places like Australia, kicking off the disappearance of big, likable, and edible animals. This is true of Europe and Asia, think woolly mammoth, as well as North and South America too. For a species that has only roamed the planet for a few 100,000 years, Homo sapiens has had a big impact on the future fossil record. That also means that even if people were to disappear tomorrow, evolution would be driven by our choices to date. We're making a new homogeneous world of certain favored plants and animals, like corn and rats, but it's a world that's not as resilient as the one it replaces. As the fossil record shows, it's a diversity of plants and animals that allows unique pairings of flora and fauna to respond to environmental challenges, and even thrive after an apocalypse. That goes for people too. If the microscopic plants of the ocean suffer as a result of too much carbon dioxide, say, we'll lose the source of as much as half of the oxygen we need to breathe. Then there's the smudge in future rocks. People's penchant for burning coal, oil, and natural gas has spread tiny bits of soot all over the planet. That smudge corresponds with a meteoric rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, now beyond 400 parts per million, or higher than any other Homo sapiens has ever breathed. Similar soot can still be found in ancient rocks from volcanic fires of 66 million years ago, a record of the cataclysm touched off by an asteroid at the end of the late Cretaceous epoch. So odds are, our soot will still be here 66 million years from now, easy enough to find for any aliens who care to look. Of course, there's an important difference between us and an asteroid. A space rock has no choice but to follow gravity. We can choose to do differently, and if we do, there might still be some kind of human civilization thousands or even millions of years from now. Not a bad record to hope for. If you're interested in learning more about the impact we're having on the planet, we recommend The Unnatural World by David Biello, the author of this lesson. Thanks for watching.
One of the ways in which we are starting to look at counteracting the impact of humans on our planet is by encouraging companies to carry out something called a Lifecycle Assessment when they start to make new products. Now, a Lifecycle Assessment assesses the environmental impact of a product at 4 stages. The first stage is the extracting and processing of raw materials. So, for example, plastic coming from crude oil means that it comes from a finite resource. Wood coming from trees means it comes from a renewable resource, therefore more can be grown and therefore having a lower environmental impact. But sometimes there are no alternatives for those raw materials. If we need something to conduct electricity, we're more than likely going to be using copper, in spite of the fact that we are running out of copper and again it's a finite resource. Manufacture and packaging. So what packaging will this item need? How much carbon dioxide is being produced during manufacture? and therefore the impact that those sections have on the environment. The use of the product and its operation, how many times will it need recharging, etc. And finally, the disposal of that product, including the transport and the distribution at each stage. Remember, in this, if you have a heavier product or a product with a higher density, then that product will have a higher transport cost due to the maximum load in certain HGVs. Now, some things are actually quite hard to quantify in an LCA, and that makes it much more difficult to make comparisons. So sometimes you will have to bring in your own knowledge of these materials if you are asked to make an evaluation of them. It's easy-ish to quantify the values for things like energy use, like carbon dioxide emissions, and how long it takes to break down the substance naturally. But it's very difficult to quantify factors such as negative visual impact of rubbish. That is what we call a qualitative factor. The easy way to remember quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative means, to quantify means we can place a number or a value onto that impact. So the kilograms of carbon dioxide produced, the energy use during manufacture, but you cannot put a number on things like the impact of rubbish on the environment. So that means we need to think about it a little bit more carefully. So I want you to give some of the impacts which plastic waste has on our planet. Write a list and we'll go through some afterwards. So you may have things like this. This is Peanut the turtle. He got stuck in that plastic when he was little and his body grew around it because it couldn't snap it. Peanut's still that shape, which is quite sad. They freed him, they cut the plastic off, and he's lived in captivity ever since. This image I found quite upsetting actually. We normally think of plastic pollution having an impact on sea life, and we don't normally think about our other animals on Earth that are being impacted by this rubbish. There's an underwater shot of just the amount of plastic in the ocean currently. That can be eaten by fish, it can be eaten by bigger fish, and it can get into food chains. Another impact of this plastic just joining together really and creating these huge masses of plastic that float around in the ocean and onto our beaches where they get deposited. This is just one of the many images of humans trying to clean up their beaches. Another quite upsetting image, a lot of the plastic in the ocean actually comes from the fishing industry, not just our waste. So, thinking of all of that, there's quite a controversial question on the screen at the moment. I've got plastic straws and I've got paper straws, and I want you to think about how those two materials would compare if you were to write a life cycle assessment on them. So let's go through this a straw at a time. So the first thing you probably thought of, plastic is non-renewable. It's made from crude oil, which is finite, but plastic straws are reusable. They keep the shape, they don't biodegrade, however, they are much lighter, whereas paper straws, they are renewable, so they come from wood, which comes from trees, but they are only one use. They are biodegradable, so that's going to cause less waste in landfill. They come from trees, but they don't keep their shape, so a lot of people don't like them because they are not very good at being straws, especially if you've got a thick drink like a milkshake. And they are slightly heavier. Now, in an exam, there would typically be prompts to help you, and quite often these come in the form of a table. So what I'm going to do on the next slide is we're going to put what we came up with into one of these tables and look at what other information we would need to make a life cycle assessment. So, crude oil, that is a finite resource and it will run out, and it's non-renewable. For the plastic straw, you'd probably be given something about the price of them or possibly the energy used during manufacture. But I've just put on there that they typically have a price of 100 for a pound, which implies quite a low manufacture cost. Any other details you'd need would be provided, and that's quite typical for manufacture and packaging. Again, we've got other plastic straws, they are reusable. The issue was when we weren't reusing them and we were disposing of a high volume of plastic. And yes, that means if we are reusing them, there's less waste produced over time. And they keep the shape, which is very, very useful. Disposal, they don't biodegrade. So if they go into landfill, they will stay there. And that can cause the environmental harm that we talked about on the previous slide, especially in regards to animals. They are slightly lighter, which again would imply lower transport costs. With paper straws, trees can be regrown, which means it's renewable, that resource is replaced as quickly as it's used. Manufacturing and packaging, typically, I think the cheapest I've seen them is about 10 for a pound, which implies a higher manufacture cost than the plastic straw. Again, this is an area where they typically provide you with details. They are only one use, so they will need replacing each time, and they don't keep the shape. But when it comes to the disposal of them, they are biodegradable, so even if they go into landfill, they will break down, so it's much less harm to wildlife. But they are heavier, which implies a higher transport cost. Now, looking at the big picture here, it depends on whether you are thinking about your own use or the environmental impact. Comparing the two types of straws, it's pretty clear to see that the paper straw would have a much lower impact on the environment. And that's one of the reasons many companies have started moving towards them. On the screen is an exam style question that uses a similar table to the one that we constructed in the previous slides. I'm going to work through this question and break it down, and then later on I'll give you your own question to have a go at. Now, as this is a longer question, the first thing I need to do is I need to bug it and I need to find that command word. So I'm skimming through for that command word and I can see that it is an evaluate question. You may remember from a previous video that evaluate means to summarise the advantages and disadvantages to justify a conclusion. So within this evaluation, I need to compare what I've been given, add in my own knowledge and use that to justify a concluding statement. So let's read through the rest of the question now. So I've been asked to use my knowledge and the information from that table above to just evaluate a statement that's been made. The statement that's been made is that the life cycle assessment shows that using plastic bags has less environmental impact than using paper bags. So what I'm going to be doing is looking through the information I've been provided, link that to my own knowledge, and just one stage at a time comparing those two different types of bags and then justifying all of that with a conclusion at the end. So let's read through the rest. Ethene is used to make polyethylene. Ethene obviously coming from crude oil, and polyethylene is used to make plastic bags. The table below shows data from a life cycle assessment for a plastic bag and a paper bag. So let's look at the raw materials first. They're either going to be finite or they're going to be renewable, and obviously we can see the plastic bags being made from crude oil and the paper bags being made from wood. Energy used, that implies during the manufacture. So a high energy would be bad, especially because our energy typically comes from fossil fuels. The solid waste, remember this would generally end up in landfill. So a high solid waste would be bad dependent on the type of waste. So if it's biodegradable, then solid waste, that waste will break down. So it's not as big of an impact to the environment as if it's a non-biodegradable material. Carbon dioxide production, remember this links to global warming. And the volume of fresh water used, that water would then have to be retreated before it could be used again. So now, a row at a time, I'm going to work through and write a life cycle assessment. So I'm going to start with the raw materials. So, from the raw materials, we can see that plastic bags are formed from a finite resource, crude oil, which will run out, whereas paper bags are made from wood, which can be regrown. So there's that implication that the paper bags are better. So let's have a look at the next row. So we're looking at energy use. Now, as I said, a high energy use here would be a disadvantage because that energy typically comes from fossil fuels, even though it's only a slight difference in these two numbers. So, plastic bags use less energy during production, which is an advantage as energy typically comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So let's have a look at the next slide. So looking at the mass of solid waste here, remember that the plastic bag is not biodegradable. So any solid waste will go into landfill and will stay there. Whereas with the paper bag, yes, there is a higher mass of solid waste. However, that is biodegradable and it will break down naturally without having an impact on the animals that are living in that habitat. So paper bags have a higher mass of solid waste produced. However, this waste will be biodegradable and will break down, whereas the plastic waste will remain in landfill unless recycled. So the next bit, mass of carbon dioxide. Now, this one's a little bit tricky because again, it depends on the resource that's being used. Yes, paper bags have got a much higher mass of carbon dioxide produced here. However, because they are made from trees, that carbon dioxide was taken in when that tree grew. So overall, there is no change to the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment. We call that carbon neutral. Whereas with the crude oil, the plastic bag, crude oil is locked up carbon. So if that carbon dioxide is now being released into the atmosphere, there's nothing taking that back in. So technically the higher impact here, in spite of the higher numbers being in the paper bag, is the plastic bag. So paper bags have a higher mass of carbon dioxide produced, which is linked to global warming. However, trees take in the carbon dioxide during their growth for photosynthesis, so this will be taken in, unlike the carbon dioxide produced by the plastic bags. So our last line, and on our last line after this we are going to have to make that concluding statement. Now, there is no hiding here that the paper bag has got a higher environmental impact because it's using a higher volume of fresh water, and that water will then be needing further treatment so that there's no pollution or so that it can become potable again. So, paper bags use a much higher volume of water. This is a disadvantage as this water will require further treatment to ensure it is potable. And here I've put in my concluding statement as well. Overall, I believe that in spite of there being some advantages to plastic bags, paper bags have a much lower impact on the environment due to the renewable source of their raw materials and the carbon neutral nature of their manufacture. So, now that I've walked through one example with you, I've placed another question on the board, on the screen even, for you guys to have a go at. Take your time. I'm going to put a timer on to help you. Okay, so let's have a look at marking this. Now, we are obviously aiming for a level 2 answer, which will be 3 or 4 marks. In this case, it's a judgment, so your opinion being strongly linked and logically supported by a sufficient range of correct reasons. So for you to get that level 2 answer, you have to have had an opinion. You have to have given that quite clearly in your answer. So let's have a look at some of the links and the information you could have got from that question to help you support that answer. So if you were talking about the raw materials, you could talk about the fact that wood will not run out, whereas aluminium will because it's a finite resource. And also it's more expensive to process aluminium from its raw material. Looking at the mass of the frame, the wooden frame is going to be more expensive to transport, it will use more fuel, and it's going to be more difficult to handle. If we're looking at the useful lifetime, the wooden greenhouse would need replacing more often, whereas you'd need fewer aluminium greenhouses over time, and both materials could be put to further use, so aluminium can be recycled repeatedly. Now, your concluding statement, your opinion, there is no wrong answer for that. You must have just justified it with the information that we provided. So now we've completed the lesson. Thank you for your time again. If you could now go on to complete the follow-up questions, that would be fantastic. And I'll speak to you in the next one.